Is translation cheating when it comes to learning another language or reading its literature? Now, this is pretty controversial, especially in my world, where we like to learn to speak ancient Greek and Latin and really live those languages. And with that internalization, that personalization of the languages, we're able to read the ancient literature. That's the whole idea, right? That's the promise. So what place could translation possibly have in such an ethic, in such a philosophy, in such a pedagogical method? Well, I'm going to tell you in this video, it's something I even recommend to my beginner students as well as intermediate and advanced. And yeah, so it's going to be interesting, and I think very useful for every single one of you out there, no matter what language you want to learn. I'm Luke, and this is polýMATHY. Now, when it comes to translation, there's two actually completely different things that we need to talk about here. And one kind of translation I think isn't very useful, and another kind is extremely useful. And the one that I don't think is as useful is one that's used in, say, there's my old copy of Wheelock's Latin up there, the typical grammar translation textbook. This grammar translation, we demonize that. I certainly have on this channel, and many other people out there have demonized grammar and translation. And there may be a pretty good reason behind that. And the reason is because if you take, say, these traditional books, they give you some grammatical concept and maybe a bit of text. Maybe it's a bit of Cicero or Plutarch or whatever. And then you have to translate it into just whatever your native language is, wherever you're learning. It could be English, Italian, French, Japanese, whatever. Let's just use English for simplicity. So you translate it, and then you read the translation that you wrote in English, and that's how you are reading. You're not really reading the Latin. You're not reading the ancient Greek or the Coptic or the Sanskrit or whatever it is. You're reading a translation that you made spontaneously. You're proving your ability to parse and analyze, which is actually very useful. It's not nothing, but it's not the same thing as reading. And Randall Booth talked about this too, as many others have. The phonological loop. What's this about? If you have a text, and if you've been trained to translate ancient Greek or Latin into English, what happens is when you try to take any text and you try to read the original, you're constantly converting every single word into English and kind of making a pseudo-English phrase every time you read the target language. You're not really reading the language. That kind of translation is definitely something that I think should be avoided or used in small doses, because it seems to block one's ability to fluently read, especially in the long term. And I've seen this for even advanced people, professors and things like that, where they can't really read the literature, Latin or ancient Greek, because even though they know so much about it, but because they're constantly in this translation mode. That's the skill that they're really good at, but it really blocks them from fluent reading. So not that translation. So what translation am I talking about? I'm talking about using some kind of translation. This is a Loeb. These Loeb editions, which have the original ancient Greek or Latin and the English, very good translation of the English. They aren't necessarily the cheapest thing out there. I try to get these used or discounted, or someone's giving them away or something. That's a great way to get these. You don't necessarily need these. There are translations for pretty much all the great literature out there that are online and free. I'm going to show you where in this video, but I like the physical copy for purposes of demonstration today. So I have this handy of Lysias. So what I'm talking about here is using a translation that's already been done by someone else in order to get into the literature. And I find this is probably one of the better ways to supplement one's study, especially with ancient Greek. Now, there's so many things out there to get into Latin, but as like I've talked about in these videos, going stepwise through Latin, even using grammar translation, for example, Wheelock's or something, and you're able to get into some literature. It's so much easier to get into Latin literature, as hard as it can be, because not only, of course, do we have the same alphabet, but like I talked about in the Why is Ancient Greek Hard video. Why is it so difficult? It's because we don't share nearly as much vocabulary, especially, and a lot of weird things too in the grammar and so forth, the morphology, that just a little bit opaque when it comes to ancient Greek. And then guess what? Almost every other ancient language out there is even harder. Maybe Old English is a wonderful exception, but things, Sanskrit and Coptic and ancient Egyptian. So it can get pretty difficult to get into those. And there are graded readers out there, right, that try to teach you to read. I've talked about them extensively. The Jonathan Roberts approach to learning ancient Greek is to read all the readers. So those exist for ancient Greek. Obviously, there are a lot of great readers out there for Latin, but the ancient Greek ones, most of them aren't actually very good, or maybe they're mediocre to okay, or they're good if you already know ancient Greek. But there's so little out there for other languages. Now, I experimented with what I'm about to tell you about in this video over on polýMATHY Plus with Coptic, and it worked scarily well. Which is very interesting. Even when you are a beginner, you may be able to take advantage of this technique. And what am I talking about? Okay, I'll tell you right now. It is to take a translation. So here I have Lysias. Well, let's look at Lysias 1. Now, this is on the murder of Eratosthenes. What I think you should do, say you really want to read Lysias. I don't know why you'd want to read Lysias unless you just love the orators like me. Let's just say you really want to read Lysias. And actually, the orators are probably the coolest thing about ancient Greek prose. I'm just not going to lie. We'll talk about that later. That's for a different video. How could you do this? We have the ancient Greek on the left, and then you have the English on the right. Should you read the ancient Greek first? In this little technique that I'm going to show you, no, I think you should start with the English. And this is what you should do. I'm going to read the first English sentence. I should be only too pleased, sirs, to have you so disposed towards me in judging this case as you would be to yourselves, if you found yourselves in my plight. Okay, I read that in English. Now, already, you're kind of like, what? It's like, ooh, hey, this is a little odd. Now, hopefully you have some context of what's going on here. I'll give some to you here before we go further. This was a speech written by Lysias for someone else to defend himself for having murdered some fellow named Eratosthenes who was sleeping with his wife. That's what this is about. So he's defending himself for having murdered the adulterer, right? So that's the first context. Okay, that's helpful. These are nice because there's some context given here, but you can usually find on Wikipedia some explanation for some of these important pieces of literature. It could be the Iliad, it could be, Cicero, it could be literally almost anything to give you the context that you might need. Because that could be a huge block too. The best literature is usually so steeped in historical context that you might not follow that. I think it was totally fine to read about that in English, so you know what's going on. Because the alternative is that we may be pushing off getting into the really good literature for a very long time, well past the intermediate stage, and I mean we should bring it in sooner. Okay, so what do I mean here? So I just read that, and it's like, whoa, that was kind of, what was that? Let me read it again, because it's written this translation, and many of these out there are kind of old-fashioned. This translation may not be the easiest English to read. I'll read it again. I should be only too pleased, sirs, to have you so disposed towards me in judging this case as you would be to yourselves, if you found yourselves in my plight. And to simplify, he's basically saying, hey, judges, I think you should treat me in this case like you would treat yourselves, as reasonably and in accordance with the law. So don't treat me unfairly, is basically what he's saying. Okay, so we understand that, and we said it out loud. That's very important. I said it in the English out loud. Now let's read the Greek. Peripoluan poiesai men Andres, totoiutu sumas semoi dikastas peritutu tu pragmatos genestai, oioiper an humin autoisee tetoiaut pepomtotes. Now, you're probably wondering, did Luke say this was also for beginners? And I actually think so. The reason is that we need input. We need input badly in order to acquire language. Huge amounts of input. And some have talked about, I think I've seen some of these videos talk about, comprehensible input is impractical because to get input down to the level of comprehensibility, it's very hard. I very much sympathize with that idea because we need to make the input comprehensible. What we're doing here is we're doing a version of what I talked about in the video about using dubbed TV shows in your target language. There it is. And what I talked about there, I use Star Trek as a great example because I really like Star Trek, and so does my fiance. And she thankfully helped me get into this. For one, she's a professional translator, which is fantastic. So I came to appreciate like translation as a skill and as an art a lot more, just knowing her. And another, though, is because, of course, she's Italian. So we watched all of Star Trek from the beginning in Italian first, and then rewatching it again in English. And, again, it's wonderful. So we just love Star Trek. It's fantastic. The thing that I got, at first I was like, oh, dubbing and translation. I was like, I don't know. It seems like I'm just like allergic to the concept for a number of reasons, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video. But what amazed me was how useful it was. Or say, classic example, people who want to learn Japanese often watch anime. That's how I acquired a lot of my Japanese. I watched anime. Actually, I'd never watched anime before, but I was stationed in Japan, and I was like, okay, when I want to learn Japanese, I assume anime has some good programs, maybe one or two, right? So I decided to watch it, and then I had English subtitles.
僕はすでに死神のノートを現実だと疑ってなかったが、
俺はお前に何もしない。
So I was following the story perfectly, because I had the subtitles, but I was constantly getting the auditory input of Japanese. And after many hours of this, I was acquiring phrases, grammar, all these things that you get out of the experience. So what we're doing here is we are being the original audio of the program, and we're also giving ourselves the subtitles. And I do think both of these should be done aloud because it helps one concentrate, I think. Let's go on the next sentence. For I'm sure that if you had the same feelings about others as about yourselves, not one of you but would be indignant at what has been done. You would all regard the penalties appointed for those who resort to such practices as too mild. Eo garoid hoti ten auten gnomen peritonalo nekoite, hem per humon auton, u cania hostis, u capitois gegenem menois, aganactoie, allapante sam periton, tatoiauta epite deunton, tas de mias micras egoiste. So, I knew exactly what's going on because I read the English, even aloud, which I think helps, because it helps you stay with it. I think this is my method. This is how I do this. And then I read the Greek and it resonates for me and I can hear it. But let's say I didn't know any of these words or I hadn't read this before, then I would have a lot of trouble. I wouldn't necessarily be able to follow, but I would be giving myself input. I would be able to give myself the sounds of the words, little bits of grammar like tas de mias micras. Like, maybe I don't know that's the accusative plural. Maybe I don't even know what the accusative is yet because I'm that much of a beginner in the language. But I'm giving myself these little bits of input. These things, they go together. And because grammar, how is grammar really acquired? Grammar can be learned through a sequence, such as in a grammar translation book or other grammar books. All of them are great, are wonderful indices. I got the Smythe book right here. These are all tremendous tools, right? But acquisition of a foreign language's grammar is a somewhat mysterious process. Linguists haven't fully understood exactly how this happens for L1 or L2. Basically, the point is that you have to get as much input as you possibly can that is somewhat comprehensible, if not very comprehensible, that N+1 that Krashen talks about, right? And as you do that, you're exposed to the grammar, and then inside your own psyche, you start to form these things and these connections. Just as watching anime, one can learn a lot of Japanese and hear like, there's a plural on that word, but not on that. But that's interesting. Doesn't seem to be plurals except for certain things like pronouns. You start to formulate, you consciously be aware of things, and subconsciously you're absorbing way more than you were consciously aware of. So that's the idea. Get as much input as possible and make it comprehensible. Let's do one more sentence here. And these feelings would be found not only amongst you, but in the whole of Greece. For in the case of this crime alone, under both democracy and oligarchy, the same requital is accorded to the weakest against the strongest, and so that the lowest gets the same treatment as the highest. Kai tau tu kania monon parhumin hutos egnos mena, alen hapasei te heladi, peritu gar mono tu akidematos, kain demokratiai, ka oligarchiai, heau te timoria, toisas tenestatois, prostus ta megista dynamenus apodedotai, hosteton keriston, ton auton tun canin toi beldistoi. So this is just the beginning, but if you just do this, you're not going to acquire that much of the language. It's better than nothing. And a lot of people, I think they might fool themselves. That's why I've always been really skeptical about even editions like this, or even this one in Italian, which we'll look at a little bit, where you have the translation, because it's so easy just to read the English side. You know, why would, you kind of look at the Greek and you get something, but are you really reading the Greek? Or are you just using that translation to follow everything, and you're getting a little taste of the Greek, but how much are you really learning from that? Are you really learning to read the Greek? And if you just do those two things, probably not. But there's more to this technique and how to use translation. But even if you don't use my technique, you do need to acquire language. And it's so helpful to have an instructor to do it. And why not take advantage of the incredible courses and instructors we have at Ancient Language Institute? Because we do teach you, when it comes to, say, Ancient Greek, we teach you from the beginning, and especially by means of story and context. We do this with Old English and Biblical Hebrew and Latin too. We can give you everything you need to know. Yes, we explain the grammar explicitly. We teach you all those things too. We try to do it in the target language, especially at the higher levels. But the key is that through communication, through our approach, which engages our students, hearing the language, speaking the language, and responding in the language. Each of our students at Ancient Language Institute has access to everything they need to succeed when it comes to understanding the grammar, understanding the pronunciation, and this includes being taught how to read the target language and then being asked questions in the target language about what you just read, and then you have to respond. And then we even have discussions in the target language too. It's fantastic. It's a lot of fun. We have intermediate and advanced classes in all 4 languages. If you want to sign up for the summer term, that is April 12th when the registration is due. Gotta sign up by April 12th. Really look forward to having you there in our next classes. So, what about this translation thing? And I even recommend this to my beginner students as a supplementary thing that they can do right away. So we saw some of this, and what I did, and I compared it to watching Japanese anime or whatever television show in a target language. As long as you have the subtitles, you can follow everything that's going on. And if you listen to enough of this over time, if you're enjoying it, if you're following it, you're going to acquire at least some of the language. That's basically what I just showed you now. I read each English sentence once, and then I read the corresponding ancient Greek sentence. But that's really not enough, I think, to properly acquire this, to really do this. And I think one can fool oneself that one is reading the language and reading in the language when they're really not. Let's just imagine that I do remember everything that I read in the English. And maybe that section was as far as I went for the day. If that was my session, my first part, like let's say that was a paragraph, what I need to do now is go back and reread the Greek, all of those sentences together, and just give myself the auditory input, the reading input, even though I didn't necessarily understand all of it. And if I'm a beginner, I probably understood very little of it. But gotta read it again. Peripoluan poiesai man Andres. Totoiutu sumas moedigastas peritutu tu pragmatos genestai, hoioi peran humin autois, et toiaut pepontotes. Eugeroid hoti etenauten gnomen peritonalo necoite, hemper perihumon auton ucanea hostis, uc epitois gegenemenois, aganactoie, and so forth. So you go through the whole thing again, and you see, it depends on your level. If you are intermediate to advanced, you could probably, say Greek for this, you could probably actually understand a lot of it, but there'd be new vocabulary. And if you really want to acquire this well, you could go more hardcore and look up every word, maybe even in a Wiktionary, and try to learn the bits of the grammar that way. That analysis part is very, very useful. I talked about something like this in the scriptorium video as well, but read as much as you can, and many times as you can, of the things you already read. All right, let's take a Latin example. Let's go to Terence. Aha! So this is not an English translation, an Italian one. Fortunately, I'm an Italian reader and speaker, so I can get dual language translations and I can understand them. So here's just a little bit from the prologue. I have the Italian here. Poiché s'è accorto che le sue commedie sono oggetto di critiche malevole e che questa che sta per presentare è denigrata già dai suoi nemici, l'autore stesso si autoaccusa. Okay? So then let's assume I completely understand it, which thankfully I can, and you can too. Maybe I'll find an English translation and throw it up here so you can follow the Latin. And I'll show you where to get these English translations in a second. So then I would read the Latin. Postquam poeta sensit scripturam suam, ab iniquis observari, et adversarios rapere in peiorem partem, qua acturi sumus indicio desse ipserit. And so forth. That's how I could go through that. But then, let's say there was something that I didn't quite follow. I would zero in on that. And then I would read the original again. Postquam poeta sensit scripturam suam ab iniquis observari, et adversarios rapere in peiorem partem, qua acturi sumus indicio desse ipserit. Now, if you've been following my videos, especially since the last year, you probably recognize that this is the Kephalos method, essentially. He recommended that I do this when I asked him, how do I possibly learn Homer? Well, he said, read a bit of translation so you know what's going on, and recite it out loud and then memorize, right? So that's the Kephalos method. But the principle is the same. You have the translation, a nicely done translation. One has made it make sense in English or other languages. And with that, you can follow everything. With that, you're able to make perfect sense of the story. And this is what's so important. Not necessarily that one needs to follow the story in the original, but one has an ability to follow it, so you have this context. It's like having the subtitles on the anime and seeing the visuals. You're following everything, but you're getting all this input at the same time. And in my experience, this is super helpful. When I read Lysias, did I do this with this one? No, I didn't use that. I used something else. I used one of these wonderful, which one was it? The Finum Publishing or the Stedman? These are all great. The Stedman, I've talked about some of these on polýMATHY Plus. The Stedman and the Finum, I guess, Finum Publishing and the Hadavas editions, which are great. And I've talked about those in the other video where you have all the glosses. That's great too because it keeps you reading. Those are fabulous as well. But those aren't necessarily as easy to come by. Some of them are free, others are not. And as much as those are wonderful tools and they really help you get into the language, this is what I tell my beginners too, especially with Ancient Greek, because Ancient Greek has so many obstacles to it. They're like, oh, I'm never going to be able to recognize the perfect or the aorist or, these different things. And why is it deponent? I don't know. Oh, piroi, I don't know. It is, though, in the future. Those kinds of things. And that can be discouraging. Then this can go for Latin too. I think the barriers are just higher in Greek, so I've seen this a lot more, and I've tried to come up with a lot more solutions for Greek than I have for learning Latin. But really, it's to go for any language. To go for a modern language. You're trying to learn the language, but you really want to read the literature, but you just haven't been able to do it. I would say, get the target literature that you really want to read, get the translation of it, and start doing this. Read the translation. Do sentence by sentence, phrase by phrase, and you'll go back and forth, but get to the point where you remember what's going on in the gist of that paragraph, any given paragraph, and then read the original again aloud. Reading aloud is so important in this. Doesn't matter if you don't think your pronunciation is very good or if you don't know anything about the pronunciation. Doesn't matter if you don't know the first thing about the grammar, the subtleties, as long as you are able to understand by means of the translation and other context you can get from somewhere what the story is about and what's going on. That's all you need to get started with this, because that way you are absorbing the language. And through these repeated readings, you're starting to really appreciate it. And this goes even for utterly unfamiliar languages like Coptic, where I tried this and it worked really well. And I can't wait to do more of it to really acquire Coptic, because it may be kind of the only way. Where I get, I got the Bible, I got the English, and I got the translation, and I reading them aloud. This works really well with the Bible too, because a lot of people know the Bible stories well, so you have a translation. A lot of people out there learning Ancient Greek, they want to read the Bible in the original. Fantastic. Well, guess what? You start today. Absolutely use these courses like we provide at Ancient Language Institute. Use other tools, everything you have at your disposal. But I think this can really excite you. This is why I really recommend it, even to my beginners. Some of my beginners, they want to read the Bible, they want to read the Iliad, they want to read Plato. Well, here's what you, oh my gosh, oh no. Got a little excited there, hold on. So here I have Plato. Here's the Contubernales version. This appeared in one of my videos, I think a couple years ago. It's Latin and English. So for you fluent Latin readers out there, I know there's some of you, this is really awesome to use. So quomodo vos Athenienses fecerit accusatores mei in eschew, ego quert ipse quoque, illis dicentibus paene meis oblitus, adeo persuasibilis eoro ratio erat. So there's the Latin, and assuming that was totally fluent and comfortable for you, that beginning of the apology, well, then I would read the Greek aloud. Hotimen hume so andres Athenaioi, pepontete hypotone mon categoron ucoida. Ego dun autos subauton oligo emautu epelatoman, uto pitano selegon. Right, so we're assuming you're a fluent Latin reader in this case. But let's go to where you can find all of these translations right now for free. All right, so how do we do that? Well, we were just reading Plato's Apology. So what we're going to do is type Persius, Plato Apology of Socrates, right? And then first link right here on Persius's website. And here we go. Aha. Now, we have an English translation over here. And here we have the Greek. You can decide if you want to have the Greek on the right or the left, or if I hit focus here, I switch them. And then we have the load button, and I get the English. So it's an old site, but it works really well. And the translation, it's a free translation. Why do people buy books that are translated? Because there are really good translations out there that are more modernized, that are easier to read. But if you can deal with some of the archaisms that exist in some translations, this one's 1966, so it's not that old. Some of them are from the 1800s, even 1700s. You can find on these websites. Now, instead of using Latin, I'll just use the English. How you, men of Athens, have been affected by my accusers, I do not know. But I, for my part, almost forgot my own identity. So persuasively did they talk. All right, so there's that much. And that goes this far. Hotimen hume so andres Athenaioi, pepontete hypotone mon categoron ucoida. Ego dun autos subauton oligo emautu epelatomen uto pitano selegon. So there it all is. And if you're a beginner, I'm telling you, this can be a great supplement to your training. If you're in a class, if you're using another book, the more you read a language, especially like Greek, which is so much harder than Latin, the more you read it, the more your eyes go over the text, the more you have the process of converting, ciphering, right? This written version of the language into language that you produce with your own mouth. It doesn't matter how much of a beginner you are. It doesn't matter if you're not pronouncing everything correctly. You're going through the process now. And if you just have been dying to read Plato in the original, but you just haven't gotten around to learning anything about ancient Greek, I'm telling you, don't wait. As long as you can turn these letters into sounds, and I have the video for that, how to pronounce ancient Greek, how to sound it out, you can do this now, today. And if you're really struggling when you start hoti men humes, you're going really slowly, you're having a lot of trouble with it, well, keep practicing. This is what your goal is, and this may really excite you. And maybe you could only get through this 17 alpha here. Maybe that'll take you some hours. Maybe this is all you can do in a whole day or less. That's fine. I'm telling you, if you do this with consistency, you will be giving yourself input, and it's input from native speakers. It's the only input we have from the native speakers, or the actual preserved ancient texts, right? You're getting the original language right here, much as you would if you were plopped into, say, a country you've never learned the language, but you're hearing the language. Well, in a matter of days, you're going to learn some phrases, especially if you get a chance to interact with them. If you have some context to understand it, the translation gives you all of that context. What if you've been dying to learn Virgil's Aeneid? Well, look, hey, there's more than translation here. John Dryden. We have a 1910 version. Here, I'll load this one by Theodore Williams. Arms of the man I sing, who first made way, predestined exile from the Trojan shore to Italy, the blessed Lavinian strand. Well, that's a weird translation. I don't actually even like it that much, but it's fine. It'll do. Arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris Italiam fato profugus, la vignaque venit litora. Anyway, so we get the idea, right? Use these translations to understand what's going on. Now, if this is not interesting to you in the acquisition of Latin or ancient Greek, well, maybe this technique isn't for you, but I bet this could be really useful to almost anyone out there. If you want to truly acquire these languages, well, we have to read. I learned that the hard way. I've talked about that before, that I, for the longest time, wasn't supplementing my acquisition of ancient Greek with reading stuff in the original. In addition to using some of those like Hadavas editions or the Fainum publishing or the Stedman editions, those are fantastic. Those are incredibly helpful and wonderful too. There's a little bit more intensive because you have to really, understand the language at, more of an intermediate level. Whereas this can kind of work for anybody. And I think this is really how probably in antiquity they were learning a lot of the ancient Greek. The Romans were learning the ancient Greek literature. They had translations of it available. And from those, they're able to follow everything and then bit by bit figure out what was going on. But especially through repeated recitation, that input was really helpful. And I think that is, in fact, how they acquired a lot of their ancient literature knowledge, using the aid of translation where possible. Here's a bit of Cicero, De Amicitia, about friendship. Quintus Mucius Scaevola, the augur, used to relate with an accurate memory and in a pleasing way many incidents about his father-in-law, Gaius Laelius, and in every mention of him did not hesitate to call him the wise. All right? And then the Latin. Quintus Mucius augur multa narrare de Gaelio Laelio sociero suo memoriter, et iucunde solebat, nec dubitari luminomni sermone appellare sapiente. So if you're a lower intermediate reader, this might be difficult to parse and work through and not really get it. What this does is you already know what's going on, and if you're reading it and you're enjoying it, if you have the translation, you instantly know what's going on, and you can use that to get yourself to a level of fluency. Nor do you have to do this forever. Eventually, if you reread, because that's the key, I think, in this technique, you understand everything that's going on here in the original after you've read it a few times. Quintus Mucius augur multa narrare de Gaio Laelio Sociero, and so forth. That is the key. And I, for the longest time, just didn't do this because I thought it was cheating. And I was conflating two very different things. I was conflating taking those sentences like we just saw in the Latin and then translating them. This is what a lot of people do in order to read, where they're writing an English translation of the original or doing that English translation spontaneously in the head instead of reading the original and understanding and feeling in the original. I do think that is very problematic and ends up being an obstacle to one's long-term reading fluency. But today, I'm telling you, you can use these translations now if you really wanted to read, you name it, Latin or ancient Greek, do it. If you don't have some fancy paper book, you probably don't need it. There's surely some translation out there, even if it's not on Perseus, that might already exist online, written hundreds of years ago, but by someone. Use that and take advantage of it so you can finally enter into the target language. Because what's the point of all this? Are you going to have to do this forever? Probably not. The idea is that you get to be a fluent reader, at least with that target text or several texts, to the point where less and less and less you'll ever have to look at the translation. And when we need so much input, especially as beginners, in order to get through that intermediate stage and get to a more advanced stage, we just need so much reading input. This is a great way, I think, to do it. So try this out. I'd love to hear if you've done this before. If you like this, try this and right away, and then leave a comment under the video. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks to each and every one of my Patreon supporters. Really appreciate it. And thanks again to the Ancient Language Institute. And we'll see you next time. Valete eroste. This is a very useful stepping tool